There is a lost city that has kept millions of people curious for generations. A city worshipped by some, studied by others, searched for by archaeologists, debated by historians, and remembered through one of the greatest sacred epics ever preserved. A city that refuses to remain only in the realm of story. It is described with gates, walls, water, royal power, sacred purpose, engineering, and a disappearance so dramatic that it has kept one question alive. Was Krishna's Dwaraka only a sacred memory? Or was it also the memory of a real place? What if the search for Krishna's lost Dwaraka began with the wrong map? Long before modern history was written, India preserved one of the greatest stories ever told, the Mahabharata. For millions, the Mahabharata is sacred history. For others, it may be approached as epic literature. But either way, it is impossible to enter the world of the Mahabharata without being drawn to Krishna. To devotees, Krishna is divine. In Indian spirituality, he is one of its most beloved and significant presences. And even for someone who approaches the Mahabharata only as a story, Krishna remains unforgettable. A guide, a strategist, a protector, a statesman, a ruler, and a figure whose wisdom and presence shape the entire epic world around him. At the center of this investigation stands one of the great mysteries connected to Krishna, Dwaraka, the lost city he ruled. The capital remembered as built under his vision for his people. The tradition remembers Dwaraka as a golden city of extraordinary beauty, a city of gates, a city protected by water, a water fortress, a sacred royal center associated with Krishna himself. It was not remembered as an ordinary coastal town. It was remembered as a marvel of architecture, power, and sacred geography. A city raised from land, reclaimed from the sea. A city guarded by walls. A city entered through gates. A city surrounded by water. And then, after Krishna left the world, Dwaraka disappeared. The waters swallowed it. That is why Dwaraka has never disappeared from human curiosity. The memory is too vivid. The description is too specific. The city feels too real to dismiss casually. For generations, this story has been treated mainly as a matter of faith. But on this channel, we ask a different question. What if sacred tradition is also a form of human memory? What if the story of Dwaraka preserves the memory of a real water fortress, a real island city, and a real catastrophe? For decades, the search for Dwaraka has focused on the coast of Gujarat in western India, and important discoveries have been made there. Submerged structures, stone anchors, and evidence of ancient maritime activity. Those discoveries matter. They should not be dismissed. The sacred geography of Gujarat matters. The living devotion connected to Dwaraka matters. But there is a deeper question. What if the discoveries off Gujarat preserve an important ancient maritime layer, but not the full geographical memory of Dwaraka? What if the Dwaraka remembered in the epic tradition was not simply a coastal city? What if it was a water fortress connected to gates, mountains, sacred kingship, engineered water, and catastrophic submergence? And what if the strongest match for that complete profile is not in India at all? What if Krishna's lost Dwaraka points across the ocean, to South America, to the Andes, to the vast inland sea between Peru and Bolivia? What if the evidence points to the Americas?
Before we go further, I want to make one thing very clear. This investigation is not meant to dismiss the archaeological work done off the coast of Gujarat. It is not meant to diminish India's sacred geography, and it is certainly not meant to reduce the importance of Dr. S.R. Rao's pioneering work. In fact, we need more archaeology like that, more underwater exploration, more coastal surveys, more scientific investigation into India's ancient ports, trade routes, submerged structures, and maritime history, because every discovery helps restore a part of India's past that was either forgotten, ignored, or never properly studied. The discoveries near Gujarat matter. They show that India's western coast preserves deep maritime memory. They point to ancient seafaring, commerce, sacred geography, and a coastal civilization far older and more complex than many people once imagined. So the question is not whether Gujarat is important. It is. The question is whether the discoveries of Gujarat fully answer the larger Dwaraka profile preserved in the epic tradition. A site can be archaeologically important and still belong to a different layer of history. A pot can be ancient and still not be the complete Dwaraka remembered in the texts. That is the distinction this video is asking us to consider. Some of my recent investigations on this channel have focused on Tamil antiquity, Sangam literature, and the forgotten geography preserved in South Indian tradition. But this channel is not limited to one language, one region, or one community. This video turns directly toward the Sanskrit epic tradition, especially the Mahabharata, Krishna, and the mystery of Dwaraka. It comes from volume 3 of my Best Kept Secrets book series. The focus here is true history. Tamil literature is one archive of memory. Sanskrit epic tradition is another. Archaeology is another. And when these archives are placed side by side, they may reveal a wider human memory. This investigation is not asking viewers to treat the Mahabharata only as religion, nor is it asking viewers to dismiss it as fantasy. We are asking whether sacred literature may preserve human memory, memory of geography, memory of water, memory of cities, memory of kingship, memory of engineering, memory of catastrophe. That is the purpose of true history, Best Kept Secrets. Not to attack faith, not to blindly defend tradition, but to ask whether the ancient world remembered more than modern history has allowed. So today we are not asking whether ancient maritime activity existed near Gujarat. Clearly it did. We are asking a deeper question. Does the full memory of Krishna's lost Dwaraka point only to India's western coast, or does the evidence lead us to a much wider map?
True history is not a luxury. It is a fundamental right, and it belongs to everyone. Best Kept Secrets is a 6-volume journey in pursuit of a clearer, deeper understanding of human civilization, beyond inherited timelines, beyond imposed limits, and beyond the maps we were given. It is guided by evidence, context, memory, and the courage to look again. Volume 1 is ready. Volumes 2 and 3 are now in their final stages, and the journey continues. History should speak your language. We are translating this series and narrating these videos across many languages of the world. If your language is missing, let us know in the comments. Together, let us move closer to true history, little by little. This is Best Kept Secrets. And this is where the story begins.
Before we search for Dwaraka, we must ask a simple question. What exactly are we searching for? Because Dwaraka is not remembered in the tradition as just another coastal settlement. It is remembered as something far more specific. It is a city protected by water, a fortress, a city of gates, a royal capital, a sacred center ruled by Krishna, a place associated with extraordinary architecture, a place connected to mountain geography, and finally a place swallowed by water. This is the first mistake many modern searchers make. They begin with the assumption that Dwaraka must be a coastal site in western India. Then they search for ruins near that coast. If something ancient is found underwater, the identification feels complete. But the epic memory is more complicated. The Dwaraka of the tradition is not only maritime, it is architectural, it is political, it is sacred, it is geographic, it is hydraulic, it is catastrophic. It is not merely a city beside water. It is a city organized by water. That distinction changes everything. In Sanskrit tradition, Dwaraka is often understood as a Vari Durga, a fortress protected by water. This means we should not be looking only for a port. We should be looking for a water-protected sacred center, a city where water creates separation, a city where water controls access, a city where gates matter, a city where the boundary between land and water is central to the identity of the place. In many tellings, Dwaraka carries the logic of an island city. It is set apart from ordinary land. It is protected by water. It is entered through thresholds. And at the end, it is reclaimed by the very element that once guarded it. That is a very specific memory. Once we understand that profile, the search becomes far more interesting. Because the question is no longer only this: where is an ancient Indian port? The real question becomes this: where do water, gates, mountains, sacred kingship, engineered architecture, island city logic, and submergence memory come together? That is the real Dwaraka question. For decades, the most famous search for Dwaraka has focused on Gujarat, on India's western coast. This was not a mistake. It was natural. The modern city of Dwaraka stands there. The tradition is alive there. The coastline is ancient. Maritime activity in that region is real, and the discoveries made in those waters deserve respect. Stone anchors, submerged remains, and other finds point to a coastal world with deep antiquity. India needs this archaeology. It helps restore the seriousness of India's ancient maritime past. It reminds the world that India wasn't isolated, passive, or historically late. Its coastlines were active, its merchants, sailors, and sacred geographies were connected to wider worlds. So the issue is not whether Gujarat matters. It does. The issue is whether the discoveries off Gujarat fully answer the deeper Dwaraka profile preserved in the epic tradition. And here, the fit becomes more difficult. The textual Dwaraka is remembered as a water-protected fortress. It is a city of gates. It is a royal and sacred center. It is associated with dramatic submergence. And it is connected in the tradition with mountain geography. That last detail matters. The Mahabharata does not remember Dwaraka only as a city beside the sea. It also connects the Dwaraka world with Rivataka mountain, a place of festival, retreat, and sacred geography. In the Gujarat reading, this creates a problem. The coastal site and the mountain geography are not naturally unified. The landscape has to be pieced together across distance. The water is in one place. The mountain is somewhere else. The sacred geography feels stretched. But what if the problem is not the text? What if the problem is the map we inherited? What if Dwaraka's memory belongs to a landscape where a vast body of water and high mountains are not separated at all? What if they belong to one integrated sacred world? That is when the search begins to move west, across the ocean, across the equator, into the high Andes, to a place where a sea rises into the sky. To understand the next part of the Dwaraka mystery, we must leave India's western coast, not because Gujarat is unimportant, but because the full Dwaraka profile forces us to widen the map. So now, travel across the ocean, to South America, to the great mountain spine of the continent, the Andes. And there, between Peru and Bolivia, more than 12,000 feet above sea level, lies one of the most extraordinary bodies of water on Earth, Lake Titicaca. This is not a small mountain lake, it is a vast inland sea in the sky. A body of water so large that, standing on its shore, the horizon can feel oceanic. A lake high enough to touch the clouds. A lake wide enough to carry boats, rituals, islands, trade, pilgrimage, and memory. And this matters because Dwaraka was not remembered as just another city near water. It was remembered as a water fortress, a sacred city protected by water, a city of gates, a city set apart from ordinary land, a city where water was not background scenery, but part of its identity. Now look at Lake Titicaca. It is not an ocean. But in human experience, it can behave like an inland sea. Its waters stretch between Peru and Bolivia. Mountains surround it. Islands rise from it. Ancient routes cross it. Sacred traditions gather around it. And near this basin stands one of the most mysterious monumental centers of the ancient Americas, Tiwanaku. And Tiwanaku is not just a name on a map. It is not just an ancient ruin near a lake. It is a monumental sacred center, a place connected with some of the most remarkable stonework, water engineering, and architectural planning in the ancient Americas. Nearby stands Pumapunku. There, massive stone blocks still raise difficult questions. Precise cuts, repeated forms, recessed surfaces, carefully shaped edges, and sockets where metal clamps once joined stone to stone. These are not small details. They point to a building tradition that understood stone, form, alignment, and connection. At Acapana, water was not merely present in the landscape. Water was directed through architecture. It moved through stone-lined channels. It became part of the monument itself. At Kalasasaya, gateway, sky, ritual, and stone were brought together into one ceremonial system. So when we speak about Lake Titicaca, we are not speaking only about geography. We are speaking about a sacred lake basin where many elements come together. Sacred water, monumental stone, gateways, metalwork, hydraulic design, and ceremonial architecture. That is why this landscape matters to the Dwaraka question. But here, we must be very precise. This investigation is not saying that modern Lake Titicaca, exactly as we see it today, is the entire original Dwaraka landscape. The deeper possibility is larger than that. Modern Lake Titicaca may be the surviving visible face of a much older and broader water world in the Titicaca Basin. A sacred lake landscape where water, mountains, islands, ritual pathways, monumental stone, and engineered sacred space may once have belonged to one larger system. In this view, Tiwanaku and Pumapunku are not merely impressive ruins near a famous lake. They may be surviving archaeological witnesses within that older sacred landscape. Not necessarily the entire city in its original form, but visible remains inside the sacred geography where the memory of Dwaraka may have been preserved. For mainstream archaeology, Tiwanaku is one of the great civilizations of the Andean world. But for this investigation, Tiwanaku becomes something even more important. It stands inside a landscape where water, mountains, sacred islands, gateways, monumental stone, and ritual movement all come together. This is the first major shock. The Dwaraka profile asks us to look for a water fortress connected to sacred geography. And in South America, between Peru and Bolivia, the Titicaca Basin gives us a landscape where water and sacred geography are not separated. They are one world. Water below, mountains around, sky above, a sea lifted into the heavens. Once we see that, the question changes. We are no longer asking only, was there an ancient port near Gujarat? We are asking something much larger. Where on earth do water, mountains, gates, sacred kingship, monumental architecture, island city logic, and submergence memory come together? That question leads us directly to Lake Titicaca, and then to Tiwanaku. This is where the direction of this investigation becomes clear. Tiwanaku and Pumapunku are not being treated here as casual parallels to Dwaraka. This investigation proposes that the deeper memory of Dwaraka points most strongly to the older water-centered sacred landscape of the Titicaca Basin. Modern Lake Titicaca is the surviving visible face of that older sacred landscape. And within that landscape, Tiwanaku and Pumapunku stand as the strongest surviving monumental witnesses to the world remembered as Dwaraka. Not the whole city in a simple one-to-one way, not every stone as a direct relic, but as the visible remains of a larger sacred landscape shaped by water where the Dwaraka memory took historical form. Now we come to one of the most important clues in the entire investigation. Dwaraka was not merely a city beside water. it was remembered as a water fortress. That word matters. A water fortress is not just a port. It is not just a coastal town. It is a city whose protection, identity, and access are shaped by water. Water separates it. Water guards it. Water controls who enters. Water gives it sacred power. And finally, in the Dwaraka memory, water takes it back. This is why the island city clue is so important. In many tellings, Dwaraka carries the logic of an island city, set apart from ordinary land, guarded by water, entered through thresholds, and finally reclaimed by the same element that once protected it. So if we are looking for Dwaraka, we should not look only for ruins near a shoreline. We should look for a sacred center where water itself became part of the architecture. Water as protection, water as boundary, water as access control, water as sacred separation, water as memory. Now look again at Tiwanaku. For a long time, Tiwanaku was treated mainly as a high-altitude, landlocked ceremonial center. But that picture is incomplete. The wider Tiwanaku world was deeply connected to water. Lake Titicaca, canals, ritual routes, sacred islands, hydraulic systems, and controlled movement through the landscape. Some archaeological and engineering interpretations have also explored the possibility that Tiwanaku's ceremonial core was bounded by artificial water features. Canals, drainage channels, moat-like water boundaries. These features may have helped separate sacred monumental space from the wider urban landscape. That possibility matters, because then the comparison is no longer simply this. Dwaraka was near water. Tiwanaku was near water. The comparison becomes much more precise. Dwaraka was remembered as a sacred water fortress. Tiwanaku may have preserved a sacred center shaped by water boundaries, controlled movement, and monumental thresholds. The lake supplied the natural setting. The channels and water boundaries supplied the engineered separation. The gateways supplied the ritual threshold. Together, they created a world where water was not background scenery. Water shaped the sacred space. In that sense, water was architecture. That is why the comparison with Dwaraka becomes far more serious. The match is not merely a city near water. It is the deeper pattern of a sacred city organized by water. Water protects it. Water separates it. Water gives it sacred meaning. Water shapes how people enter, move, and gather. And water preserves its memory across time. For this investigation, that is not a minor parallel. It is one of the strongest reasons the search moves beyond a coastal reading and toward the Titicaca Basin. The next clue is hidden in the name itself, Dwaraka. The word carries the meaning of a gateway, a city of gates, a place of entry, a threshold. That is not a small detail. Names preserve memory, and the name Dwaraka does not simply point to a town. It points to a function, a gate, a passage, an entrance into a protected, sacred world. Now look again at the Titicaca Basin. Near the lake stands Tiwanaku, one of the great ceremonial centers of the ancient Americas. And at Tiwanaku, the most famous monument is not a palace. It is not a tomb. It is not a pyramid. It is a gate, the gateway of the sun. A massive stone portal, carved with sacred imagery, associated with cosmic order, ritual time, and the movement between worlds. By itself, this does not prove the case. A gate in India and a gate in Bolivia could be a coincidence. But this gate does not appear alone. Even within the architectural tradition of Tiwanaku and Pumapunku, sacred gateways were not limited to one surviving monument. The Gateway of the Sun is the most famous example, but nearby Pumapunku also preserves evidence of multiple monumental gateway forms and a broader architecture built around thresholds. So this comparison is not simply one name placed beside one monument. It is gateway memory placed beside a landscape where portals, thresholds, and sacred entrances clearly mattered. It appears inside a wider pattern, a sacred water landscape, a mountain basin, a ceremonial center, a culture of monumental stone, a world of islands, routes, thresholds, and ritual movement. That is why the comparison matters. Dwaraka is remembered as the city of gates. Tiwanaku preserves the gateway of the sun. One survives in the name of a sacred city, the other survives in stone. And in both cases, the gate is not merely an opening, it is a statement. It says, "Beyond this point, the world changes. You are entering sacred space." In a landscape like Lake Titicaca, gateway logic is not only symbolic, it is geographical. The lake itself forms a sacred basin. The mountains form a natural enclosure. The islands become ritual destinations. The water routes become pathways of pilgrimage and power. To enter this world was not just to travel across land. It was to pass from one order of reality into another, from ordinary terrain into sacred geography, from open landscape into ritual center, from water route into mountain sanctuary. This is why the gateway of the sun is so important to the Dwaraka question, not because a single monument proves everything, but because it belongs to a larger pattern. Water, mountain geography, gate, sacred kingship, monumental stone, ritual movement, a protected center, a sacred space entered through thresholds. The memory of Dwaraka leads us to search for a city of gates. And in the high Andes, beside a vast inland sea, we find the most iconic monument of the Tiwanaku civilization, the Gateway of the Sun. But Dwaraka was not remembered only as sacred. It was remembered as engineered. The tradition says Krishna's city required Viswakarma, the divine architect. That image should not be dismissed too quickly. When ancient memory says a city was built by a divine architect, it may be describing more than a miracle. It may be describing awe at a level of planning, masonry, water control, and construction that later generations could no longer explain in ordinary language. So what should we look for? Not magic, not fantasy, not impossible technology. We should look for disciplined engineering. Stone shaped with intention, water directed through architecture, metal used to strengthen construction, a city planned around sacred movement and controlled access, a built world where architecture, ritual, and engineering worked together. And that is exactly why Tiwanaku and Pumapunku matter. At Pumapunku, near Tiwanaku, the stonework is not ordinary. It is not rough masonry. It is not merely a pile of impressive ruins. It is a construction language. The stones preserve crisp angles, flat surfaces, recessed forms, blind holes, holes cut into the stone that do not pass all the way through, interlocking shapes, repeated modules, and blocks that appear to have been planned as parts of a larger architectural system. Some of these stones are shaped with such disciplined geometry that they do not feel like isolated sculptures. They feel like components, architectural parts, pieces of a system. That matters. Because Dwaraka was remembered as a planned city, not a random settlement. A city of gates, a city protected by water, a city built with extraordinary skill, a city where sacred authority and engineering power came together. Now look at Pumapunku more closely. The famous H-shaped stones are not important merely because they look unusual. They are important because they suggest repetition, measurement, and modular design. A repeated form means the builder was not simply working stone by stone without a larger plan. A repeated form suggests a design, a template, a system, a mental blueprint. The recessed channels and precise cutouts suggest that the stones were meant to fit, receive, align, or connect with other architectural elements. This is not the logic of random construction. It is the logic of assembly. Then there is the question of scale. Some stones at Pumapunku are not merely large, they are enormous. The largest known slab is estimated at about 131 metric tons. Another major block is estimated at more than 85 metric tons. These are not decorative stones, These are architectural masses. To quarry them required knowledge of stone. To move them required transport planning. To place them required organized labor, technical supervision, foundation preparation, and a reason powerful enough to make the work meaningful. This is not only stone strength, it is civilizational strength. A civilization must be organized before a stone like that can move. It needs planners, workers, specialists, supervisors, ritual authority, food systems, transport systems, and a sacred purpose powerful enough to organize all of them. Then comes the metal. This is one of the most important clues. At Tiwanaku and Pumapunku, stone was not treated only as heavy material. Metal was used to join architecture. Clamp sockets were cut into stone. Eye-shaped architectural clamps, also called cramps in engineering language, were used to tie stone elements together. And these were not ordinary pieces of metal. They were made from a copper, arsenic, and nickel-bronze alloy. That detail matters, because it means the builders were not only shaping stone, they were also working with specialized metallurgy. Stone and metal were made to cooperate. Separate blocks were joined so they could behave like one architectural body. In some cases, molten metal appears to have been poured into prepared sockets. In other cases, metal pieces were shaped and seated into the stone. This was not decorative metal. This was structural metal. This was architectural metallurgy. And it changes the way we should look at the site. Because the builders were not only cutting stone, they were thinking about force, movement, pressure, jointing, stability, how one block should hold another, how a wall, channel, gateway, or platform should remain integrated. In other words, they were not only builders, they were engineers. Then comes the water. And this is where we must be very careful not to underestimate what we are seeing. This was not ordinary plumbing. This was hydraulic and hydrological engineering. At Tiwanaku, water was not merely beside the monuments. Water was directed, controlled, drained, and integrated into the sacred center. The system included drainage channels, surface canals, underground channels, and water control features. These features helped manage rainfall, runoff, seepage, groundwater, and the movement of water through the built landscape. That means the builders were not only moving water from one place to another, they were managing a living water system: rainwater, surface flow, underground flow, soil moisture, foundation stability, ceremonial drainage, urban protection. This is far more advanced than simple drainage. It means the builders understood that water could protect a city. Water could damage a city. Water could stabilize a monument. Water could flood a sacred space. And water could connect architecture to the larger landscape. They were not only shaping stone, they were shaping the behavior of water. And that should make us pause, because Dwaraka is remembered as a water fortress, a city protected by water, a city organized by water, a city finally reclaimed by water. So when we find a sacred Andean center where stone, metal, gateways, and water engineering all come together, we should not treat that as a minor coincidence. We should look carefully. We should ask whether the epic memory is pointing toward a technological profile, a civilization capable of shaping stone, joining stone with metal, directing water through architecture, organizing sacred space through gates, and building monumental structures inside a mountain water world. Even the wider Titicaca Basin adds to this picture. This was not an easy environment. It was high, cold, demanding, and yet ancient people turned it into a living sacred landscape. They built ceremonial centers. They moved stones weighing tens of tons, and in some cases more than 100 tons. They engineered water. They created ritual routes. They made the lake part of political, agricultural, and spiritual life. That is the real engineering signature. Not one miracle stone, not one mysterious gateway, not one underwater object, a whole stack of capabilities: stone, water, metal, gateways, sacred planning, ritual movement, landscape engineering, and now return to the Dwaraka memory. A city protected by water, a city of gates, a city built by divine architecture, a city of extraordinary splendor, a city remembered as both sacred and engineered. The comparison does not depend on one block, or one monument, or one isolated resemblance. It depends on the repeating pattern. If an epic says Viswakarma built a city, modern readers may hear mythology, but an engineer may hear something else. A memory of master builders, stone workers, metallurgists, hydraulic planners, ritual architects, and a civilization capable of turning water, stone, metal, and sacred geometry into a living city. That is why Tiwanaku and Pumapunku matter, because here, in the high Andes, the memory of sacred architecture has physical form, not as a vague parallel, not as a loose symbolic resemblance, but as a surviving architectural and engineering pattern, seen in stone, metal, water, gateways, sacred planning, and monumental landscape. If the Dwaraka tradition preserves the memory of a sacred engineered water city, then Tiwanaku and Pumapunku become far more than impressive Andean ruins. They stand as possible surviving witnesses of that older world remembered as Dwaraka, not only in sacred story, but in stone, in metal, in water, and in the remains of a sacred engineering landscape, where memory, architecture, and evidence still stand together. There is one more layer to the water memory, not only around the lake, not only beside the lake, but beneath the lake. Lake Titicaca was not just scenery for the ancient Andean world. It was sacred space. Its islands, shores, routes, and underwater places carried ritual meaning. At Koa Reef, near the island of the sun, underwater archaeology has documented offerings beneath the water. Ceramics, animal remains, precious materials, ritual objects, evidence of ceremonies performed in the lake itself. This is important, because the Dwaraka tradition is not only about a city near water, it is about a sacred city whose final memory is underwater. A city swallowed by water, a city preserved in the imagination beneath the surface. Now, we must be careful. The Koa Reef discoveries do not prove that Dwaraka was there. They do not prove that Krishna's city has been found underwater in Bolivia. That is not the argument. The argument is more careful. The lake was not empty water. It was not background. It was a sacred archaeological environment. Ritual did not stop at the shore. It entered the water. It descended beneath the surface. That means the Titicaca Basin gives us something rare. A landscape where water, ritual architecture, island pilgrimage, sacred kingship, and submerged memory all belong together. And once again, this echoes the Dwaraka profile. A city of water, a city of gates, a sacred royal center, a landscape of extraordinary architecture, a memory that ends beneath the water. No single clue carries the entire argument, but the pattern continues to grow. And now the question becomes unavoidable. Are we looking only at coincidence, or are we looking at surviving traces of sacred memory carried across oceans? For this investigation, the underwater ritual landscape of Lake Titicaca is not an isolated clue. It becomes another layer in the larger profile of Dwaraka memory. Now step back. Do not look at one clue alone. Look at the whole pattern. Dwaraka is remembered as a water fortress. Lake Titicaca gives us the image of a vast inland sea high in the sky. But even that may be only the visible surface of a much older memory. The Dwaraka landscape we are tracing may belong to an older and broader water world in the Titicaca Basin, a sacred lake system whose surviving visible face today is modern Lake Titicaca. Dwaraka is remembered as a city of gates. Tiwanaku preserves the gateway of the sun. Dwaraka is connected with sacred kingship. The Titicaca Basin preserves traditions of divine origin, solar authority, and sacred rulership. Dwaraka is remembered through extraordinary architecture. Tiwanaku and Pumapunku preserve monumental stonework, precision blocks, hydraulic systems, and metal stone engineering. Dwaraka ends in a memory of submergence. Lake Titicaca preserves a sacred world where ritual, offering, and memory entered the water itself. And Dwaraka is connected, in the tradition, to mountain geography. Lake Titicaca is not a coastal plain. It is a sea surrounded by mountains. This is why the Dwaraka question cannot be reduced to one underwater site. It is not only a question of ruins, it is a question of profile. What kind of landscape does the tradition describe? What kind of city does the memory preserve? What kind of civilization could leave behind a story of gates, water, sacred architecture, sacred kingship, mountain geography, and catastrophic loss? When we ask those questions, the map changes. The Dwaraka tradition begins to look less like a memory of an ordinary coastal port. It begins to look like the memory of a water-centered sacred civilization, a civilization where land, lake, mountain, ritual, architecture, and kingship belonged to one system. That is exactly why the Andes matter. Not because one name matches, not because one monument proves everything, not because one underwater discovery solves the whole mystery. The strength of this argument does not come from one clue alone. It comes from convergence, water, mountains, gates, sacred kingship, monumental stone, island city logic, hydraulic architecture, ritual beneath the water, inherited memory. When all of these elements appear together, we are no longer looking at a casual resemblance. We are looking at a profile. Mainstream archaeology has not identified Tiwanaku or Pumapunku as Dwaraka. That fact should be stated clearly. But this investigation is following the full Dwaraka profile, and the full Dwaraka profile points beyond the inherited coastal interpretation. It points to the Titicaca Basin, to the sacred water-centered landscape of the high Andes, and especially to the monumental remains of Tiwanaku and Pumapunku. This is the central claim of this investigation. Tiwanaku and Pumapunku may preserve visible remains, monumental traces, or surviving echoes of the older sacred landscape remembered as Dwaraka in the epic tradition. Not one clue, not one name, not one monument, a full profile, water, mountain geography, gates, sacred kingship, monumental stone, a sacred city shaped by water, hydraulic architecture, ritual beneath the water, inherited memory. That is why Dwaraka is not only the memory of a lost city, it may be the doorway into a hidden global history.
If this argument feels surprising, it should. It challenges historical map many of us inherited without ever questioning it. But the purpose of this investigation is not to shock for the sake of shock. It is to ask whether ancient memory preserved more than modern history has allowed us to see. The discoveries near Gujarat matter. The sacred geography of India matters. The Mahabharata matters. Krishna matters. The question is not whether Gujarat matters. It does. The question is whether the memory of Dwaraka points to a much wider sacred geography. In this investigation, the evidence leads toward the Titicaca Basin, toward the high Andes, toward Tiwanaku and Pumapunku, toward the possibility that Krishna's Dwaraka was not only remembered as a sacred city, but also preserved as the memory of a real water-centered civilization across the ocean. So, I invite you to examine the evidence carefully. Do not accept this argument simply because it's bold, and do not reject it simply because it's unfamiliar. Look at the pattern. A city protected by water, a city of gates, mountain and water together, sacred kingship, monumental stone, water engineering, a city remembered as lost beneath the water. And then ask yourself, were we searching for Dwaraka on a map that was too small? Let me be clear. This research is not trying to diminish the spiritual integrity of the Mahabharata. It is not trying to diminish Krishna's sacred importance. It is not trying to weaken India's sacred geography. And it is not trying to make the epic less sacred. The mission of this channel is accurate history, examined with evidence, respect, and care. If the deeper memory of Dwaraka points to a wider sacred geography, that does not make the Mahabharata smaller. It may make the Mahabharata even more profound. Sacred literature may have preserved more real memory, more geography, more archaeology, and more civilizational knowledge than modern history has usually allowed. Spiritual truth is not weakened when historical evidence expands. It is deepened. This channel is building a passionate, evidence-led investigation into sacred traditions, ancient memory, and world history. India's sacred epics are one major archive of that memory. But this research also looks beyond one region, asking whether the world's spiritual traditions preserve connections that modern history has interpreted through maps that were too small. The aim is not to diminish faith, but to take the memory preserved in these traditions seriously. I believe the journey will be worth your time. If this investigation made you think, please subscribe to the channel. Your subscription helps support this independent, self-funded research. Like this video so more people can discover it. Share it with anyone who cares about ancient history, India's sacred traditions, lost civilizations, or the forgotten memory of humanity. And leave a comment below, because the story was never truly lost. It was only unread. This is True History, Best Kept Secrets.